Imagine this. You've worked your entire life to climb the ladder of success. You've broken barriers, shattered expectations, and built a company from the ground up. Now you're not just a CEO. You're a respected figure in business circles, a man who has earned his place at the very top. And yet, on what should have been a routine flight, everything changes with just a few words. "Sir, you don't belong here. Please move to the back." That's exactly what happened to Marcus Reed, a brilliant black CEO who had grown used to commanding boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals. On this particular day, Marcus wasn't wearing the casual hoodie and jeans he sometimes favored when working late nights at his office. Instead, he was dressed sharply in a navy blue tailored suit, polished shoes, and a silk tie that matched the confidence in his stride. He walked through the airport with the quiet authority of a man who had conquered more obstacles than most people could imagine. When he arrived at his gate, people noticed him, but not in the way you'd think. A few curious stares followed him, some with admiration, others with the kind of judgment he had become all too familiar with. But Marcus didn't let it bother him. He handed over his first-class boarding pass to the agent, received a polite nod, and proceeded down the jet bridge. Settling into his plush first-class seat, Marcus felt a small wave of relief. The last few weeks had been grueling. Endless meetings, international flights, and the pressure of closing a major deal that could redefine his company's future. Finally, here was a moment to breathe, to sip a glass of water, and maybe even get some rest before the next round of challenges. But peace didn't last long. A flight attendant with a stiff smile and a scrutinizing look walked down the aisle, stopping right in front of him. At first, Marcus thought she might be offering him a drink menu or assisting with his carry-on. Instead, her words cut through the air like a cold blade. "Sir, this seat isn't for you. You'll need to move to the back." The sentence was delivered not as a question, not as a polite mistake to be corrected, but as a command, an order rooted in an assumption. Marcus blinked, slightly confused, before calmly replying, "I think you must be mistaken. This is my seat." He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, extending it toward her. But here's the thing. She didn't even look at it. Her arms folded, her posture stiffened, and her voice dropped lower but sharper. "This section is reserved. You can't sit here." The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. The businessman in the seat across the aisle peeked over his newspaper, eyebrows raised. A couple sitting 2 rows behind leaned forward, whispering. And Marcus sat there, steady and composed, though he felt the heat of humiliation trying to creep in. He had lived this moment before, in different forms. Growing up, he was told he didn't belong in advanced classes. In college, people assumed he was on campus only because of sports scholarships. In corporate America, he was underestimated time and time again, until he proved he was twice as capable. Now, here it was again, playing out in the cabin of an airplane. The same tired script of exclusion, dressed up as procedure. Marcus's silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. He studied the attendant, her tightened jaw, her narrowed eyes, the way she barely concealed her disdain. And then he spoke steady and clear. "This is my assigned seat. I'm not moving." The weight of his words lingered in the air. The passengers nearby felt it too. Some shifted uncomfortably, wishing they could melt into their seats. Others kept watching, silently rooting for him. But the attendant wasn't ready to back down. She leaned in, her voice rising slightly. "Sir, if you don't move, I'll have to call security." Now think about this for a moment. Imagine paying thousands of dollars for a first-class ticket, having the proof in your hand, and still being treated like an intruder in a space you rightfully earned. The sting of it wasn't just about money. It was about respect, dignity, and the way society sometimes still views people who look like Marcus. As the tension built, Marcus felt a familiar resolve harden inside him. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about something bigger. He wasn't about to let himself be pushed aside quietly. Not this time, not in front of a plane full of people who needed to see what real strength looked like. And that's when the story took a turn that nobody, neither the flight attendant nor the watching passengers, was prepared for. Marcus sat still, his eyes fixed firmly on the flight attendant. His tone was calm, but beneath his measured words was a storm waiting to break. "Why should I move?" he asked evenly. when this is my assigned seat?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The strength in his question was enough to make some passengers glance up from their phones and tablets, sensing that something serious was happening. The flight attendant's expression hardened. She wasn't interested in explanations or proof. She wasn't interested in fairness. Instead, she crossed her arms and, in a voice sharp enough for the surrounding rows to hear, declared, "This area is reserved. People like you don't usually sit here." The words hung heavy in the air. They weren't shouted, but they carried a venom that pierced deeper than volume ever could. A middle-aged woman 2 seats back gasped audibly. The man with the newspaper slowly lowered it, his jaw tightening. Even those who wanted to avoid confrontation couldn't ignore what had just been said. Marcus felt the sting. He had been through decades of fighting assumptions and prejudices. But this was different. This wasn't a boardroom where subtle microaggressions hid behind polite smiles. This was blunt, raw disrespect thrown straight into his face, and yet he didn't let anger dictate his actions. Instead, he reached for his phone, pressed the record button, and quietly positioned it on his lap. If the world needed proof of how he was being treated, he was going to give it to them. "I've shown you my boarding pass," Marcus said, his voice still steady, though firmer now. "This is my seat, purchased with my money, assigned to me by your airline. I'm not moving." The attendant's eyes flicked to the phone for just a moment, then back to Marcus. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice but not softening her tone. "Sir, if you don't move voluntarily, I'll have to call airport security. And trust me, you don't want that kind of trouble." Marcus tilted his head, a faint smile curving his lips. Not a smile of amusement, but of disbelief at how far this was going. "The only trouble here," he replied, "is the way you're treating me." A few passengers nodded slightly, subtle gestures of support. One man whispered, "He's right," under his breath. Another woman clutched her purse a little tighter, as if bracing herself for a confrontation she didn't want to witness but couldn't look away from. The tension spread through the cabin like a current. People who had been relaxed just moments before were now on edge, their eyes darting between Marcus and the flight attendant. The hum of the plane's air system seemed louder in the silence that followed. Marcus could have chosen to get up, to avoid the scene, to move back to economy and finish the flight quietly. That would have been the easier path, but he knew if he stood up now, he wouldn't just be giving up his seat. He would be giving up something bigger: his dignity, his right to be treated equally, his silent protest against a system that too often judged him not by his accomplishments but by his skin color. The attendant didn't back down. She straightened her posture and announced louder this time, "Sir, this is your final warning. If you don't move, I will call security to escort you off this plane." Marcus looked at her, his calm composure unwavering. "Do what you need to do," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The passengers around him held their breath. It was one of those moments where everyone knew a line had been drawn. On one side was arrogance and prejudice. On the other, quiet resilience and strength. The attendant hesitated, her eyes flickering with something that almost looked like doubt, but pride kept her from stepping back. She turned sharply, walking briskly toward the front of the cabin. Her heels clicked against the floor with each step, echoing in the silence she left behind. As she disappeared, Marcus sat back in his seat, his phone still recording. He could hear whispers around him now, soft voices saying things like, "That's not right," and "He shouldn't have to deal with this." But Marcus wasn't recording just for himself. He was recording for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. For every passenger who had quietly moved seats rather than endure humiliation. For every person who had been stripped of dignity in a moment when they should have been treated with respect. His heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from conviction. This was more than a dispute over a seat. This was a stand, and he was ready for whatever came next. The flight attendant hadn't expected Marcus to resist. She had expected compliance, maybe frustration, but not calm defiance delivered with such unwavering confidence. When Marcus asked, "Do you know who I am?" her reaction wasn't curiosity, it was dismissal. She gave a little smirk, shook her head, and replied with a tone dripping in condescension, "I don't care who you are. You need to move." Her words were like a final stamp of arrogance, as if nothing he could say or do would matter. But then Marcus leaned back in his seat, eyes steady, voice measured, and said something that would shift the entire atmosphere of the plane. "Good," he answered. "Because I own part of this airline." The change was instant. It was like the air in the cabin had been sucked out for a moment and replaced with shock. Passengers who had been avoiding eye contact suddenly turned to stare at him. The businessman across the aisle sat straighter, blinking in disbelief. The woman who had gasped earlier now covered her mouth with her hand. And the attendant? Her smirk faltered. The confidence she had wrapped herself in cracked just enough for Marcus to notice. The silence that followed was heavy. Everyone waited to see if he was bluffing, exaggerating, or speaking the truth. But Marcus didn't flinch. He pulled out his phone, scrolled briefly, and held it up, showing an email chain and a digital document with his name clearly listed among the shareholders of the airline. He wasn't just a wealthy man sitting in first class. He was part owner of the very company she worked for. Her face drained of color, but her pride pushed her forward. She tried to recover with a stiff response. "That doesn't change the fact that you need to comply with instructions." But even her voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by a tremor that betrayed her unease. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't need to. Instead, he calmly opened his contacts, tapped a number, and raised the phone to his ear. His tone was professional, steady, almost casual. "Ground this plane," he said. The few words rolled off his tongue with an authority that made even the pilot's announcement minutes later feel inevitable. Passengers' heads snapped up when the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received new instructions from headquarters. Please remain seated as we await further direction." There were no details, but the passengers knew exactly what was happening. The man who had been told to move had just changed the course of the entire flight. The attendant froze in place. Her eyes darted nervously toward the cockpit, then back at Marcus, then to the passengers who were watching her every move. It was no longer just about one seat or one passenger. This had escalated into something bigger, something she couldn't control. Marcus sat there quietly, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. He didn't yell. He didn't boast. He didn't need to. His calmness was power. Every second that passed reminded everyone in the cabin that this wasn't a man to be underestimated, dismissed, or treated as though he didn't belong. Whispers rippled through the rows. Some passengers leaned toward each other, whispering phrases like, "Did he just say he owns the airline?" "And this is unbelievable." Others pulled out their own phones, recording the unfolding drama. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would likely leave the walls of the airplane and spill into the world beyond. For Marcus, this wasn't about putting on a show. It wasn't about humiliating the attendant. It was about something far more important, drawing a line in the sand, making it clear that dignity isn't negotiable, and that no amount of arrogance or prejudice could push him aside. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, her earlier bravado now replaced by visible unease. She muttered something about needing to check with the lead supervisor, but didn't move right away. Her pride seemed to be battling her fear. The stares of dozens of passengers weighed on her like a spotlight. She had turned what could have been a routine moment of customer service into a public humiliation. Not for Marcus, but for herself. And yet, Marcus wasn't celebrating her downfall. He wasn't smirking or gloating. He was steady, resolute, almost solemn. Because for him, this wasn't just a personal victory. It was symbolic. It was a statement that sometimes, the best way to confront disrespect is not with rage, but with undeniable truth and the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly who he is. The flight hadn't moved an inch down the runway, but already the story of this plane had taken off. And as Marcus sat in his rightful seat, watching the attendant struggle with the reality of who she had just confronted, every passenger understood they were part of a story they would never forget. A story that was only just beginning to unfold. The captain's announcement of a delay rippled through the cabin like a wave, and instantly, every passenger knew it had everything to do with the standoff that had just unfolded. People shifted in their seats, some whispering to their neighbors, others daring to glance directly at Marcus and the flight attendant. The silence between them was heavy, charged like the air before a thunderstorm. The once confident attendant now stood frozen in place, Her face pale, her body stiff. She seemed to shrink under the weight of dozens of watchful eyes. Passengers who had stayed quiet earlier began to murmur more openly now. A man in business attire leaned toward the person beside him and whispered, "Can you believe this? She really tried to kick him out when he owns the airline?" A young woman with earbuds dangling from her neck shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable." That was pure discrimination. Every word of support and disbelief only deepened the growing tension. Marcus, meanwhile, remained calm, his phone still in his hand, his composure unshaken. He wasn't reveling in the chaos, nor was he gloating. He sat back in his first-class seat as though he belonged there, because he did. His calm presence was in stark contrast to the attendant, who was now visibly unraveling. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her uniform. Her eyes darted nervously toward the front of the plane where supervisors would soon appear, and her lips pressed tightly together as though holding back the panic that threatened to spill. Within minutes, 2 ground supervisors boarded the aircraft. The cabin buzzed with anticipation. They were dressed in crisp uniforms, carrying tablets and earpieces, the unmistakable look of airline authority. The moment they appeared, passengers straightened in their seats, eager to see what would unfold. The supervisors approached Marcus first, their expressions professional but respectful. One of them nodded politely and asked, "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" Marcus didn't need to embellish. He simply played back the recording from his phone. The attendant's voice was clear, her words sharp and undeniable. "People like you don't usually sit here." The recording cut through the cabin like a knife. Gasps erupted again, louder this time as the passengers realized they weren't just witnesses. They were part of evidence that could not be denied. The supervisor's face tightened as he listened, his jaw clenching at the blatant disrespect captured on the recording. The flight attendant's composure shattered. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but her words tumbled out in stammers. I didn't mean it like that," she muttered, her voice trembling. It was a misunderstanding." But the passengers weren't buying it. From the back, someone muttered, "That didn't sound like a misunderstanding." Another passenger added, "We all heard it." The cabin had turned into a courtroom, and the verdict was clear. Marcus stayed quiet, letting the evidence and the witnesses speak for themselves. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth was already on his side. The supervisors exchanged looks, their decision already made. One turned to the attendant and said firmly, "Please gather your things. You're being removed from this flight." The announcement sent a ripple of satisfaction through the cabin. Some passengers clapped softly, others nodded approvingly. The attendant's eyes filled with tears as the reality of the moment sank in. She tried to plead, her voice cracking, but the supervisors remained unmoved. They escorted her down the aisle, her head lowered, her earlier arrogance gone, replaced by humiliation. The passengers watched in silence, some sympathetic, others silently cheering the justice that had just been served. When the aisle cleared, Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "This wasn't just about me," he said, addressing the supervisors and anyone within earshot. "This is about every passenger who deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." His words weren't delivered as a speech, but as a truth so clear it resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. The supervisors nodded, apologizing directly to Marcus. They assured him the airline would conduct a full investigation, and that incidents like this would not be tolerated. Their tone was professional, but it was also tinged with respect, the kind reserved for someone who had proven they would not be pushed aside. As Marcus settled back into his seat, the mood of the cabin shifted. Relief washed over the passengers. The murmurs of tension turned into conversations of admiration. People leaned across aisles, whispering about how they had just witnessed something extraordinary. For some, it was entertainment, a story to tell when they landed. But for others, it was a powerful reminder of the importance of standing firm against injustice. The engines hummed again, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the plane prepared to finally take off. But this was no longer just a routine flight. For everyone on board, this was now a story they would carry with them forever. A story of arrogance brought low, of quiet strength triumphing over prejudice, and of a man who had refused to move from the seat he had rightfully earned. When the plane finally lifted off the runway, Marcus remained in his seat, gazing out of the small oval window as the city lights disappeared beneath the clouds. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but inside, the atmosphere was different. Lighter, calmer, almost reverent. Passengers who had been tense only an hour earlier now sat with a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They weren't just flying to their destinations anymore. They were carrying a story with them, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of this aircraft. Marcus didn't smile in victory. He wasn't the type to celebrate someone else's downfall, even if that person had disrespected him so blatantly. Instead, he sat with a reflective calmness. For him, this wasn't about winning. It was about sending a message. He knew people were recording. He knew the story would spread, but more importantly, he knew that the real power lay in what people would learn from it. As the flight continued, some passengers found the courage to approach him. A young man in economy who had quietly observed the ordeal came forward, his voice shaky but sincere. "Sir, I just want to thank you. Most people would have just moved, but you stood your ground. You don't know how much that means to someone like me." His eyes glistened as he spoke, and Marcus nodded, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "Always know your worth," Marcus said softly. "Never let anyone convince you that you don't belong where you've earned your place." Others joined in. A woman in her 40s leaned over from the row across the aisle, saying, "What you did today. It wasn't just for you. You spoke for all of us." Her words echoed what everyone was feeling. This wasn't just about one man and one flight attendant. It was about countless unseen moments in people's lives when they had been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside. Today, Marcus had shown that silence wasn't the only option. By the time the plane touched down hours later, social media had already erupted. Passengers had posted videos, tweets, and photos, each one spreading the story further. Within hours, Marcus's calm defiance and quiet authority were trending worldwide. Headlines appeared across news sites. CEO confronts discrimination at 30,000 feet. Passenger refuses to move. Groundsplane. And airline faces backlash after viral video of first-class incident. The airline had no choice but to respond. By the time Marcus arrived at his destination, their official statement was already out. An apology to Marcus, an apology to all passengers on the flight, and a promise of new training programs to ensure dignity and respect for every traveler. Their words were carefully chosen, polished by public relations experts. But everyone knew the real reason for the apology. It wasn't just the videos. It was Marcus himself, the way he had carried himself with grace, dignity, and an authority that couldn't be ignored. In the days that followed, Marcus gave a few interviews. When reporters asked if he was angry, his response was simple: anger doesn't fix problems. Accountability does. Change does. Respect does. When they asked why he didn't lash out or raise his voice, he replied, "Because power doesn't need to scream. Sometimes the quietest stand makes the loudest statement." His words resonated deeply, not just with those who had followed the story, but with people who had faced their own battles with prejudice, exclusion, and doubt. For Marcus, the incident wasn't just about reclaiming his seat. It was about reclaiming the narrative, proving that no one has the right to decide where another person belongs. His refusal to move became symbolic, a metaphor for refusing to be pushed out of spaces society often tries to exclude people from. He hadn't just stayed in first class. He had stayed in his power. Back at his company headquarters, Marcus carried on as usual. Board meetings, strategy sessions, and negotiations filled his days. But those who knew him noticed a subtle change, a sharper sense of purpose, a deeper conviction in everything he did. He had always been a leader, but now he was something more, a symbol of quiet resistance and unshakable dignity. As for the passengers from that flight, they told and retold the story to family, friends, and co-workers. For them, it wasn't just about seeing a CEO stand up for himself. It was about witnessing an act of courage that reminded them of their own worth. They had boarded that flight expecting a routine trip, but they had disembarked carrying a memory that would last for years. A memory of a man who refused to be silenced, who showed that dignity isn't granted by others, but claimed by standing tall when it matters most. And so the story of Marcus Reed became more than just a viral moment. It became a lesson, a reminder that strength doesn't always roar, that justice sometimes comes in the form of calm words and unshakable resolve. On that day at 30,000 feet, one man's refusal to move reminded the world that everyone deserves respect, that no one can strip away your place when you know you've earned it, and that sometimes the most powerful way to fight back is simply to stay seated.